Hello there, I'm Steve from Mac84. As you may know, I'm a bit of a computer archivist. I love diving into old discs, CDs, and tapes just to get a look at what might be on those and to try and preserve them for the next generation of enthusiasts. And once in a while, something comes across my desk that changes the way we think about these systems. And I want to share something really cool with you today. Here I have 3 very special development discs that were recently donated to the channel. Each of these CDs contain a macOS for CHRP release, and 2 of them have software macOS ROMs built in, allowing these to theoretically boot and install on a CHRP compliant system without a physical macOS ROM installed. But what is CHRP, and why weren't these versions ever released? Well, to find out, let's go back a bit. In 1994, Apple debuted a brand new series of computers, the Power Macintosh. These systems had brand new IBM Motorola PowerPC processors, and these RISC-based Macs were super quick. For over a decade, Apple's new Macs would run PowerPC chips. That is until they switched to Intel and then back to Apple's own ARM-based solution. But today we're going to be talking about a brief period in 1995 to 1998 where Apple actually let third-party companies sell Macintosh-compatible computers, like this one by Motorola. Even with these new PowerPC-based Macintosh computers, Apple was struggling to gain market share with the Mac OS, and they were hurting financially. During this time, Apple had some serious competition from cheap Wintel PC boxes that had a good enough graphical user interface thanks to early versions of Windows. This meant that the Macintosh was no longer the only game in town when it came to a simple point-and-click user interface. After a lot of back and forth, Apple finally decided to start experimenting with licensing the Mac OS to other PC manufacturers, enabling them to create Mac OS compatible computers. This is of course similar to how Microsoft licensed MS-DOS and Windows to a lot of different PC manufacturers. The idea was if there were more Macs in the marketplace at different price points offering different features, the Macintosh market share would go up. Of course, you don't hear much about these machines anymore because that plan sort of didn't work, but we got really close to a second wave of the plan that is super exciting. For the first wave of these Power Mac clones, Apple would meet with manufacturers like Motorola or Supermac or Radius and so on, and they would agree on a set of terms for their licensing deal. Apple would license the rights for the Mac OS like System 7.5 or System 7.6 and allow them to bundle it with compatible hardware. Apple would then take pre-production computer systems from these companies and put them through a stringent certification process to make sure they were truly Mac OS compatible. Now, some of these clones weren't without their quirks, but Apple wanted to make sure that the Mac OS, compatible applications, and compatible hardware wouldn't run into major issues with these clone computers. Apple worked with these clone manufacturers to make sure that the logic boards and other parts going into these systems were Mac compatible, all the way down to the Macintosh ROM. After all, Apple was installing the same ROMs in their Power Macintosh computers, so this ensured compatibility. The way Apple tells it, this program wasn't too successful for them, and it actually hurt their sales. But from a consumer perspective, you actually had a choice. You could either buy a Mac from Apple or from another company. And usually, people who wanted to get the most bang for their buck in buying a new computer, they went with the clone manufacturer, because the clones undercut Apple on performance, price, bundled software, and hardware accessories. So you can go and shop around, and often you'd find a much faster Mac for a lower price than Apple. Apple ended up hating this because competitors would often release super fast computers with even dual or quad processors that would wipe the floor with Apple's offerings, at pretty competitive prices too. This was extra painful for Apple because they made a good profit on their higher-end, top-of-the-line Power Macintosh computers, and now some of these more higher-end clones were eating into those lucrative profits. In late 1997, Steve Jobs returned to Apple as interim CEO. Steve's goal was to make Apple healthy again, and to achieve this, he made some pretty drastic changes. Part of his first actions were reducing Apple's product line, so he got rid of things like printers and the Newton message pad, and he set his sights on the clone program. He wasn't too fond of this clone program and tried to renegotiate the licensing agreements. However, he met a lot of resistance, especially from Power Computing. This led to Apple buying out Power Computing and essentially closing down the clone program. Although there were some remnants that would remain until 1998, this decision by Steve Jobs would kill off the clone program for good. But what's really exciting is these Macintosh clones almost had a second wave, and I've got the proof right here. To understand why these CDs are so special, we have to know that in 1991, Apple, Motorola, and IBM formed the AIM Alliance, with one of their goals being standardizing the PowerPC computing platform to attract more users and support more operating systems. This evolved into the PowerPC reference platform in late 1994. Although Apple was still doing sort of their own thing with their Power Macintosh systems, and so by late 1995, a new standard, CHRP, or Common Hardware Reference Platform, was born. With this new standard brought new requirements like the use of open firmware as the computer's BIOS. This would ensure that operating systems like OS/2 Warp, Solaris, AIX, PowerPC versions of Windows NT, and the Mac OS could theoretically run on these CHRP systems. Although there was some initial excitement about CHRP in the industry, the PowerPC-based standard failed to receive much adoption. It couldn't put a dent in the Wintel x86-based PC market. By 1997, Apple really didn't have much to show for it. And although, according to Apple's press release, macOS 8 did have some CHRP support built in, it still required you to have a physical macOS ROM in that CHRP-compliant system. Something that I don't think was too common at all, especially since there weren't many CHRP systems released to begin with. And that's what makes these three CDs so special. Each of them contains a macOS for CHRP release that was never released by Apple. To add to that excitement, each one of these discs is marked as a release candidate, so these were pretty far along. The first disc here is macOS 7.6, that's right, pre-macOS 8, with a date of May 1997 and a code name of Bloom County. Next, we have a release of macOS 8 for CHRP platforms, codenamed Outland, from August 1997. And finally, we have a macOS 8 CD from September 2nd, 1997, containing macOS 8 for CHRP systems. Now we could speculate what's on these discs, or I could put them in a computer and we could see what's on them. Let's start at the beginning with 7.6, and so I'm going to open this up here. It looks like a standard install to me. If you double click on this, you get the familiar screens, and it just acts like a normal macOS installation. However, there are a few things on this disk that I want to look at that are interesting. So if I go to the README file, you can see this is labeled macOS 7.6 for CHRP, and of course, so is the disk there. And it's the first operating system from Apple to conform with a new industry standard. So that's interesting that they reference the whole platform there, and if you Google that ISBN number, you could find a whole PDF of all that CHRP goodness. Unlike other versions of the macOS, Apple does not provide all of the software components that came with this computer. Specifically, Apple has not provided the video or Ethernet solutions, as these technologies are not defined by CHRP architecture and are up to the computer manufacturer to supply. Okay. Sound input and output drivers are included in this release. However, your computer manufacturer may supply alternative or additional sound drivers. Oh, that sounds fun. Because CHRP is a new architecture, versions of the macOS previous to 7.6 will not boot your system. So yeah, you needed a special version of macOS 7.6 for CHRP to boot your CHRP system. That makes sense. We have some CHRP-specific troubleshooting contents here, including PS2 devices. Oh my goodness, I'm not going to go through all of these, but that is quite interesting. There's a lot of stuff they tested for here. So it looks like they're just telling you to use the Windows key instead of the Command key and some of the other mappings here. But that's interesting. Wow, they put a lot of thought into this. Resetting PRAM is not functional with the PS2 keyboard. That could be problematic. And you could have a parallel port on your CHRP system, it seems. That's pretty neat. Besides the README file, there's one more thing that I found very unique about this CD, and it's in the system folder. We have a system enabler 356. This system enabler is not on any other macOS releases, and this is a CHRP-specific system enabler meant for probably those Motorola clones or whatever that they were using at the time to certify these CHRP systems. And so this has a date of May 20th, 1997, but what's interesting is if we look into this with ResEdit, we could find out some more information. So first, I'm going to open up this System Suitcase folder on the System 7 disk here. If we navigate to str pound, and this is for the strings related to the macOS, and we go to negative 16395, you can see this lists a bunch of different systems, and these strings are actually displayed in the About This Computer window. Notice how it no longer says About This Macintosh. Well, that was a change to make sure that it was generic enough to talk about these macOS compatible systems or these Mac clones. Now, what's interesting is, if I open this up again, now these IDs correspond to the default IDs of the Macintosh hardware. So if you had a PowerBook or a PowerMac, that's how these computers knew what to display in that About window. There was some hardware handshake and some stuff going on where the OS could understand what machine you were booting on. Now, if you scroll down, we have some Power Macintosh stuff here. We have some PowerBook stuff. If we scroll all the way down here, we could see we have a bunch of strings here that just say Power Macintosh. These will become a little bit more important later on. But if we scroll all the way up to around 406, 407, just keep in mind it's blank. That's important for one reason, because if we close out of this and then we open that system enabler file, and we have a bunch of less stuff in here compared to the system folder, but if we go to that same value, we could find more strings. And this says there are 407 strings. Well, what do you know? If we scroll to the bottom, look what it says, macOS on CHRP. But this is only with that system enabler. So what I think this means is when you're booting into that system enabler, that's when you would see this macOS on CHRP on this About This Computer screen. And that tracks with some of those screenshots I've seen online of those Motorola clone systems where they actually say that in the window. Now, we don't see that here on our system because we're in an emulator and we're not using that system enabler, even though it's actually installed on our hard drive, because this is actually macOS System 7.6 for CHRP. It's installed on this emulator and it's running fine. But we can see we have that system enabler here, but it is not using that enabler. What's also cool about this is we have some UART port names, and these are actually COM ports. So your CHRP system could have COM ports. And we have some information here, but also we have some icons. So if you had a CHRP system with serial ports, they were labeled COM1 and 2, and look at that, you had some icons that would probably be displayed in a control panel or when the system started up or something like that. So that's really all I found about System 7.6, so let's move on to macOS 8. This is the disk that was marked Outland. So let's open that up. You can see right away that it looks pretty similar, but we have a CHRP Extras folder. We'll look into that in 1 second. But if we open the installer, just showing you it's your standard macOS 8 installer. And if we scroll down, you can see a lot of these options are very similar, if not the same, to the retail release. Now this disk has a August 1997 date. So if we take a look at the information here, and if we open that CHRP Extras folder, you'll see there's actually quite a lot of extras here. So let's take a look at these. First, we have a README, so let's take a look at this release notes document. And there's a lot of ROMs listed here and a lot of talk about ROMs. And from what I gather, essentially, this is saying that these ROMs here are to help with development. We have references here for Cobra and Viper. Those were Motorola development PowerPC systems. And so those boxes would likely have been used during certification or testing of this version of the macOS. And then there are some notes here. Everything looks stable. This is B3 final candidate. And we also have some notes here that the boot ROM and the macOS ROM files must be updated for this release. And it's saying that while it is still true that Motorola firmware must be used to flash the macOS ROM, if testing ROM in RAM, no flashing is necessary because the ROM image comes from the disk. And so ROM in RAM is something very important, which we're going to learn about in a second, because essentially this predates the macOS 8.5 functionality where you actually had a ROM file in the system folder. And so if we actually look on this CD on macOS 8 and we look in the system folder, you will see we have a macOS ROM. This is not there on System 7.6, but we have a ROM here and it's labeled macOS for CHRP 1.1 with the date of August 19th, 1997, and the version is 1.0 B3. Now just jumping ahead here briefly to compare apples to apples literally, let's jump into that other System 8, and this is a later release from September, but if we compare the ROMs side by side, you can see that they are the same, or at least seemingly the same. This is version 1, and the other one is version 1.0 B3. So the one on the right is obviously the later, more final ROM. So I think that's interesting to note that they're both in there. And of course, if we go into the System 7 system folder, there is no ROM there. There's only that system enabler. Now let's continue looking at these extras. Now, Bloom County was the name of a comic strip and appears to be the code name of macOS 8 for Chirp. We have an Ethernet extension. We also have some extensions manager stuff. Okay. Startup disk and different sound drivers. So these were likely unique for these Chirp systems. We also have a PC key editor. Okay, so we need a Chirp compatible system with an attached PS2 keyboard. I wonder if that'll work on my StarMacs. Probably not, but it looks like we have a README here. We could contact Bruce if we have any questions. That's good to know. This application will only work on D1 or later Chirp 1.1 ROMs. Attempting to use it with 1.0 ROMs will hopefully result in an error message only. When using a PC keyboard on Chirp, the incoming PC scan codes are translated into Macintosh equivalents by the native driver. Oh my gosh, this is complicated. So this could help you translate controls and commands with a keyboard. That is interesting, something I never would have thought was a thing that you needed, but hey, they thought of that. Then we have some ROMs here. So we have a Cobra boot ROM, a Viper boot ROM, and a macOS boot ROM, and we have an uncompressed version. That's interesting. And ROM Mondo Chirp. So these ROMs were obviously meant for development purposes, and the idea here is that on the final version of the macOS release for Chirp, the ROM would be in the system folder. So when that system booted up the CD from open firmware, it had the macOS ROM in software, and it would load that into RAM. Therefore, you didn't need that physical macOS ROM installed on your hardware. And apparently Chirp systems didn't need that, but maybe a small non-macOS ROM was needed for these prototypes? Who knows, maybe this was just for development purposes. And now let's look at macOS for Chirp. This is the one dated September 1997. And again, we have a standard macOS 8 install. The only difference here is we have a macOS licensing extension folder. So let's open this up. We have a README, and this is talking about the licensing details here. So we have a bunch of coding stuff here to be aware of, some fixes for control panels. It is intended that in its shipping form, this extension will not run on non-Apple hardware as identified by the information in the Ethernet or 2C ROM. As an aid to testing and debugging, this feature can be disabled by res-editing the debag2 resource and changing its value. So obviously there was still some macOS licensing stuff going on. Maybe Chirp still had some low-level licensing built into it. I'm not too sure, but it does seem very interesting that this stuff has been thought out. Oh, okay, so we have some information about replacing some of the imagery and some of the strings on the About This Computer window. So we were looking at that earlier, and this is just giving you some technical details about that. So we have an extension that would go into the system folder. Okay, this is version 2. And let's open this licensing extension. Oh my goodness. Okay, so this is a technical note, and it looks like this was modified last on July of 1997. Okay, let's scroll back up. We have some features here. Hardware identification, software identification, licensing specific features. Okay, so I think this is all about this computer window. Yeah, here we go. So it supports a limited level of customization to allow licensees to tailor the system to their use. So you can change the picture and some of the text displayed. All right, so that's your standard macOS window here. Let's see some of the options they give. Okay, yeah, Global Computing Incorporated. Totally normal. Yeah, as of System 7.6, this Macintosh-specific reference has been removed in favor of generic terminology. Oh, look at this! Moofintosh 2000. Oh, this is fantastic. We are a Moofintosh 2000 household. Yeah, so this goes into a lot of technical details. If you want to play around with customizing that, I'm sure this is nothing new to those of you who played around with ResEdit back in the day, but very cool to see an official document talking all about this stuff. Okay, so let's take a look at the system suitcase here on the macOS 8 Outland CD. And if we look in those same areas for the strings here, for the About This Computer window, and we scroll all the way down, look at that, we see macOS compatible. Before this just had Power Macintosh. And I think if we scroll up to the early 400s here, there it is, we see macOS on Chirp. So that's really cool. So now let's boot into macOS 8 for Chirp. And you could tell I'm actually on here because if I go to the About This Computer window, look at that. macOS 8.0, macOS on CHRP version 1.1. Now, I think the strings here work a bit differently because on system 7.6, those strings are in that system enabler, which we can't really open or use, I guess, on an emulator. And I also tried on real hardware. I guess I just can't trick it, but somebody smarter than me can probably figure that out. But here it is. That string is right there. It's really active, and that's really cool. And I did discover also that on the retail release of macOS 8.0, if you look in that same directory, you can find mentions of macOS on CHRP. However, it was removed apparently on 8.1. So you could still see those CHRP remnants on macOS 8.0. Maybe that's what Apple was referring to when they said that macOS 8 had CHRP support on it. So those are all the goodies I found, but hopefully if you find anything else, you'll let me know in the comments section. So what will I be doing with these rare CDs? Well, I'll be putting them up on eBay, of course, and charging $5 billion for... No, they've already been archived. They're on archive.org and they're on Macintosh Garden for you to explore. I've tested these CDs in a variety of Macintosh emulators and on some hardware, and they actually boot up just fine, because why wouldn't they? They see a Macintosh ROM and they install. What would be really cool to see would be one of these versions running on CHRP hardware, especially those versions that didn't have a hardware macOS ROM installed. If you have one of those systems, or if you try this out, let me know in the comments section. I'd be really curious to know how it works out. Now, I did have some friends with some oddball PowerPC systems, like an Apple network server and an IBM RS-6000 computer, but unfortunately, they were not able to get these systems to boot on those computers. But thank you very much, folks, for trying. I certainly appreciate it. I also tried some PowerPC emulators to try and get one of these systems to work on it, but I didn't have much luck. So unless a Motorola PowerStack drops in my lap, I don't think I'm going to be able to boot any of these systems on a non-Mac computer. Thank you for joining me today in exploring what could have been with macOS 8 on these CHRP systems. It's something that's super fascinating to me, and I still hope to dive deeper into these Macintosh clones and that entire program soon. If you like these kinds of videos, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and I'll catch you right here next time on Mac 84.